Thank you very much. Should be all set. Welcome to the Road to Recovery Social Science Engagement Session. Our recording has just now started. So I'd like to begin, we're in a virtual format, but I would still like to begin our meeting today with a land acknowledgement. So we begin by acknowledging land to acknowledge the indigenous peoples of the land that we're on today. And while we meet in a virtual platform today, we'd like to acknowledge the importance of the land we each call home, of the land that the birds that we're all working collaboratively to protect call home as well. And we do this to reaffirm our commitment and our responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improve our own understanding of local indigenous peoples, their cultures, and our integrated human ecological environment, which is the focus and the need for this meeting today, and so much of our conservation work in general. So I'm hosting the meeting today from Carborough, North Carolina, which is the traditional land of the Lumbee people. And I personally pay my respects to this community, to the elders of this community, both past and present, and to current members of the community who may be in our meeting today. Thank you for being here. I'm going to post a link in the chat to a native land search tool. The tool will work for zip codes in Canada and the US. So I invite you to plug in your own zip code of the area where you are working from today or from where your bird conservation work really takes place that has significance to you. And if you feel inclined to share acknowledgement to that land in the chat, I'd be happy to pull those together and share back with the group as a follow-up to our session, the importance of the lands that we're all representing today, even in this virtual format. So we're all coming together around two important topics that mean a lot to all of us if we're on this call, and that's bird conservation and that's social science. So I'm thrilled to see you all here. I appreciate your interest in this critical conservation topic. It is what I spend all of my time doing these days, is connecting bird conservation and social science, and I truly love the work that I'm doing. I'm excited to share it with you today. So our meeting today is hosted by Road to Recovery. Many of you on this call have attended other Road to Recovery events. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time today focused on what Road to Recovery is, but I invite you to explore our website, r2rbirds.org. Road to Recovery is an initiative born from the alarming loss of 3 billion birds since the 1970s. And we're really founded and running and operating on the need to support the integration of biological and social science by targeting and identifying and addressing specific causes of declines for tipping point bird species. We're all here today for this session because this is not an easy task. Right? It's easy to say that our goal is to integrate biological and social science. Well, the how-to, the step-by-step guide is not, it's not intuitive always, and it's hard work. And I always, as a social scientist, I direct people back to thinking about yourself, your own attitudes, your own motivations, the barriers that you face, and how complex that is to summarize and explain to everyone. So if we think about expanding that to communities as a whole, to landscapes as a whole, it's a complex field. It takes a lot of patience, a lot of nuance, but it's critically important to conservation. So people in conservation, people and birds, it's easy to orient ourselves around the justification for conservation social science as people are the cause of so many threats to species, in our context, to tipping point bird species. But I'd like to shift our orientation as we begin this meeting a little bit to the idea that humans are for birds, right? That humans are the solution to our bird conservation problems. And while, yes, we contribute to so many of the threats that face bird populations, we also hold the tools, the keys, the resources, the motivation, and the heart to protect those bird populations. And I'd like us to enter our conversations today from that perspective as much as possible. So I'll start with a few meeting expectations and norms. So I'd like you, when possible, to remain on mute unless you're presenting or asking a question. And consider keeping your camera on, which I can see a lot of your faces now, which is wonderful. Even if you're feeling like this little guy on the screen, it is a Friday afternoon, Friday following Halloween, which Halloween on a Tuesday should just not be possible. But we've made it to Friday, and it's nice to talk to faces. So as much as possible, I invite you to consider keeping your cameras on, particularly during the parts of our session today that are conversation focused, so that we're able to connect together. I'd like to acknowledge and respect that we're all entering this conversation from different starting points with regards to social science integration into bird conservation. There's value in this conversation for everyone, no matter how long you've been a PhD level social scientist, or if this is your first introduction to conservation social science in these contexts. We welcome your input, we welcome your questions, your expertise. There's a place for value of everything we're all bringing to this conversation. So I appreciate your help in keeping our conversation inclusive, respectful, and productive today. Please add your questions to the chat throughout the conversation. We are at, what are we at? 68 participants now. So we will try our best to get to as many questions as possible. As you put questions in the chat, if it's possible for you to indicate who those questions are directed to, I will be sure that if we're not answering them during the course of our meeting today, I can get answers following up with the presenters, and I'll share out a shared document that's a compilation of questions that were posed in the chat that maybe we didn't have time to answer. So a quick overview of our agenda before we move forward. You're in the welcome. You've been welcomed to the meeting. I'm Katie Holland. I'll be walking you through the meeting today. Really excited to see all of you. Thank you for the privilege of your time this Friday afternoon. We'll begin with a presentation on Conservation Social Science 101. As I said, we're all coming into this with different backgrounds in the conservation social science field. We'll orient ourselves around common theories, themes, and important considerations when we're having conversations about conservation social science. The NABC Human Dimensions Subcommittee has recently put together a step-by-step guide for integrating social science into bird conservation. I'll walk you through that document. You'll be receiving that document in a follow-up email, so no need to take frantic notes because it's a brilliant document, if I say so myself, but it will be shared with you so you can just focus on engaging and asking questions during our time today. We'll break for some questions after those first two presentations and orient ourselves around 4 flash talks that are really incredible examples of conservation social science and human dimensions work in action. We'll go through those 4 talks and then engage in a panel discussion with the presenters of those talks, where you'll have more opportunity to ask questions. I'll then wrap up our session. And as I said, I'll give you some ideas of what to expect in terms of follow-up, as well as a feedback survey for your input on how to best productively move forward from our first conversation today, focused on road to recovery and conservation social science. So I will stop sharing here. And I will take a moment to introduce our first 2 speakers to you, who are Kyandra Rayala and Emily Neidhart. So Kyandra serves as a regional social scientist for the Midwest region of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Based in Science Applications Program, Kyandra works for a variety of teams and projects across Fish and Wildlife Service programs in the Midwest to address human and social aspects of conservation, and collaborates with other social scientists in Fish and Wildlife Service and externally on efforts to mainstream conservation social sciences. Emily Neidhart is a social scientist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also, and is based out of the Human Dimensions branch in Fort Collins, Colorado. She provides the refuge system and beyond with technical social science assistance, seeks ways to integrate social science early and often into Fish and Wildlife Service's work, and acts as a project manager for the National Wildlife Refuge Visitor Survey. So thank you both so much for being here. I will turn over the conversation to you.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Katie, and thanks everyone for being here today. I'm gonna navigate over to my screen share. Are you all seeing the presentation?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Just get things set. Well, it's great to be here with Emily to help kick off this Conservation Social Science 101 portion of this Road to Recovery webinar. And I don't think I need to introduce myself any further. Katie gave me a great intro there. So I'll just say our presentation is split up into two parts. I'm going to be covering some of that foundational content, the basics of conservation social sciences. As Katie said, this webinar really is for everyone. So whether or not you're very familiar with social science and associated methods and approaches, or whether you're perhaps wondering what exactly it means when people use the word social and the word science back to back in a sentence like that, have no fear, this webinar is for you. Halfway through, I'll then kick it over to my colleague, Emily, to talk you through some tools and resources that you can immediately dig into and begin to apply in your work. So first off, I wanted to just give you a moment to think about the social aspects of bird conservation. And as you think, I invite folks to share the first ideas that come to mind in the chat.
Seeing community, habitat conversion, communicating with the public, behaviors coming through a lot, private lands engagement, human impacts. And now there are too many to read.
Awesome. Well, sounds like an engaged group. So I've highlighted kind of 4 big buckets, and I think we can capture much of what came to your all's mind. So we know that people impact and are impacted by the natural environment, right? And this is large scale things like climate change, land use, and landscape fragmentation, and also smaller scale, context-specific human-wildlife interactions. Ultimately, we want people to coexist with wildlife in ways that have minimal impact on species, and also in ways that reduce potentially undesirable and costly impacts for people. We also know that people hold a range of values for wildlife, especially for birds, as well as for their habitats, be those natural or urban places. People relate to wildlife and natural resources in a variety of ways, including through recreation, through their livelihoods, subsistence, drawing inspiration, maintaining cultural connections and practices, and many more. Much of the work that we do in conservation, we do in partnership, whether with people in our own organizations, with people in other organizations or agencies, or with individuals and communities. And finally, we're in a governance paradigm where the partners that we work with, the publics that we serve, and the communities that we work in and are a part of not only want to be meaningfully engaged in the decisions that we make, increasingly they demand it. And in many cases, depending on the organization or the agency that you work for, it is actually our job to seek out that public involvement as trustees of wildlife resources, or perhaps in fulfilling our legal trust responsibility to federally recognized tribes. The value add of social science within the Road to Recovery's work is explicitly called out, which I was so excited to see. I also wanted to spend a moment walking through the vital role that social science can play throughout. So in partnership work, Social sciences can help us achieve an expanded vision for conservation at a landscape scale. We can work to maintain and strengthen relationships with traditional partners, perhaps groups like NABC and Partners in Flight, as well as helping cultivate new partnerships and more meaningfully engage with diverse, interested, and affected parties. It's great to see the incorporation of social science as a part of Road to Recovery's guiding principles. I hope we all can recognize that most of the conservation challenges to birds and their habitats are driven by human behavior, either directly or indirectly. But if we identify people as central to our conservation problems, that also makes people central to our solutions, particularly when we think about equitable and sustainable conservation. Species recovery and conservation typically depends on changing some aspect of human behavior, and the social sciences can really help inform our conservation planning and implementation from an evidence base, rather than simply from our assumptions or perhaps the strategies we're most familiar with. Considering Road to Recovery's emphasis on diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, the social sciences can help us understand and begin to dismantle the systemic barriers that have excluded various groups of people from being part of our conservation, research, and implementation communities, helping us achieve more socially equitable and just conservation processes and outcomes with a broader array of partners. So now that you all are hopefully sold on the value and potential benefit of social science, some might be thinking, okay, this social science stuff sounds great, but what actually is it? In defining social science, I think it's really helpful to start broadly with an emphasis on the science part. So just like the natural sciences, social science follows systematic and rigorous methods to investigate and understand some phenomena of interest. What's distinct and often intimidating for folks is that the subject or the focus of study in social science is typically not physical or tangible, but instead social. And this can be social phenomena like norms and governance, social processes like communications and decision-making, and individual attributes ranging from things we can observe, like behaviors, to things we can't directly observe, like people's values and beliefs. Just like the natural sciences, there are a wide range and growing number of social science disciplines shown here in this wheel on the left. Different disciplines are applied to understand, inform, or evaluate those social phenomena, processes, and individual attributes within a conservation and environmental management context. Each discipline brings its own strengths, weaknesses, methods, and approaches. For instance, fields like anthropology and sociology may be more helpful when trying to understand the social phenomena of culture. Conservation marketing can help inform social processes like strategic communications and helping design effective messaging. Fields like psychology and social psychology may be more useful when trying to understand individual attributes that motivate or constrain behavior change. One phrase you've perhaps heard a lot is human dimensions. This can refer broadly to the human and social aspects that we might study. So these topics there on the right. This can also refer to a specific interdisciplinary and applied field of social science that you'll see in the wheel on the left, where the focus is on those individual attributes and understanding how people value, manage, and affect or are affected by wildlife and natural resources. I also want to point out, while I still have this slide on the screen, that social science, so the disciplines in the wheel, are used to study the social topics on the right, but the social sciences we use are distinct from that topic we might be studying. So there's certainly a lot of synergy between aspects of social science and processes like communications or engagement, But when we talk about social science, we're typically talking about studying or informing or evaluating those processes, and not, for example, the process of engaging itself. And like I mentioned, important human and social considerations happen at a range of different scales within conservation and natural resource management, really encouraging us to draw on that broad range of disciplines. There are many relevant social science topics and units of analysis spanning the local and individual scale to larger contexts, be that state or national laws and policy, or societal aspects of governance and markets at regional and global scales. So thinking about those different social science disciplines and the topics that we can then study, we can ask and answer a variety of relevant research questions. These might be things like how culture influences people's relationship with birds, examining the social and economic drivers of our conservation problems or threats, looking at our target audiences and their attitudes, beliefs, and values, thinking about behavior change and what actions are needed to advance recovery. And finally, kind of big picture questions, examining how our conservation work impacts human well-being. So, at what point in a project should human dimensions or social science be considered or integrated? And I think, as Emily alluded to in her bio there, ideally from the beginning and throughout. So this figure is from a great recent paper by Nemec and colleagues that outlined how specifically social science tools and approaches can be applied throughout conservation planning and implementation. And they provide a framework, an applied case study related to wolf reintroduction in Colorado that really highlights some of the opportunities and challenges with social science integration. Certainly, we can map this onto strategic habitat conservation with its very similar phases of planning, design, delivery, and monitoring. So I just want to walk through this and the different ways that social science can show up and contribute throughout. So ideally, we are integrating social science at the onset of project planning to get a more complete picture of the social aspects of a problem and its potential solution, the power dynamics that influence which and whose problems are prioritized, and the social ecological context in which our interventions will later be applied. A better understanding of the problem and the context can also help inform building an inclusive and diverse team that has the knowledge, perspectives, and interests well suited to address the problem and achieve solutions. When we're developing goals and objectives, we might look to existing research to understand where there may be conflict or consensus, or where certain groups may be positively or negatively impacted. Perhaps the issue and the situation are one in which we choose to draw on social science best practices to inform collaboration and co-development of goals and objectives with people who will be impacted or expected to take action. Once goals and objectives are determined, we can think about the interventions or strategies, things like policies, programs, or projects that we might use to achieve our desired goals. The social sciences can really add value here in helping us examine our assumptions about how exactly we expect interventions will work and inform evidence-based approaches that are more likely to be successful and sustainable by accounting for the social dynamics and the context in which they're applied. Again, there's a lot of potential for social science to inform collaborative processes that foster community buy-in as we implement our interventions. And finally, hopefully we can get to this gold standard where we're tracking social and social ecological indicators to monitor and evaluate the success, limitations, and potentially unintended consequences of our interventions. While monitoring and evaluation is time and resource intensive to develop and implement, we know that having a feedback loop is critical to help improve our effectiveness and efficiency, just as we might do for adaptive management in our biological work. In conservation, we often make claims towards the human and social benefits of what we do, and actually monitoring and evaluating those claims we make are important accountability mechanisms to our funders, our partners, and our constituents, as well as, hopefully, important to the ethical imperatives and responsibilities of our work. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground so far, talking about different social science disciplines, different social topics and scales, potential research questions, and finally walking through those phases of planning and implementation. In various forms, these can layer together to build towards 6 broad contributions of social science in conservation. These include descriptive and diagnostic contributions, and perhaps this is where many of us initially start thinking about the value of social science. We can also use social sciences in disruptive, reflexive, and generative ways. Ultimately, we're looking to achieve instrumental contributions, helping accomplish the goals of conservation. So I want to give another minute or two before I pass the mic over to Emily to encourage you to think about what we've covered so far and where you see social science making a valuable contribution to your work. As you're thinking, again, I invite you to share any ideas related to these 6 types of contributions into the chat. And again, I'll give just a minute to pause before handing it over to Emily.
Not seeing anything come through the chat, but hopefully folks are thinking about this and how it applies to your work, and maybe we can have some time for discussion in the Q&A portion. Oh, perfect. Here we go. Sorry, I jumped again. Diagnostic, thanks, Ryan. Why bird species are declining and instrumental contributions, strategies to achieve conservation targets. Perfect.
Great. Well, I'll perhaps let folks mull on those. And I think as we advance on to tools and resources, you can help encourage people onto some of these resources so that they can achieve those contributions in their work.
Thanks, Kai. So now I'll share with you a variety of tools and resources that you can apply to your work. They're all publicly available. So the tools I'll share with you today run the gamut of allowing you to access social science information. This has animations, Kai. Better understand your audiences and the socioeconomic context in which you work. Better engage with collaborators and interested parties. And then finally, I'll walk you through a few applied examples through a suite of NABC bird conservation success stories, which demonstrate how social science has been applied to bird conservation. So the first tool that I want to share with you is our Fish and Wildlife Service Socioeconomic Profile tool. So this is a fantastic tool for understanding more about the socioeconomic conditions in areas in which you work and understanding your audience. It's capable of producing instant and customizable reports on socioeconomic conditions at different scales, ranging from the census tract level all the way up to cities and towns. And then as new data become available from the US Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics and other, the tool is continually updated. And we'll provide these slides so you can access the links after this presentation. So let's use a tipping point species to go through an example of how you might use this tool. So for this example, let's say that I am interested in working with mountain plover and conserving mountain plover. So we want to understand who we must engage in plover conservation and the nuances of how we could go about doing that. So first things first, mountain plovers are a red alert tipping point species, meaning action is needed immediately to prevent further catastrophic population declines. You can see their range here on the right, with their breeding range in orange, non-breeding range in blue, and migratory areas in yellow. The mountain plover lives and nests on high, dry plains of Western North America, along with companion species like bison and pronghorn. You can see them out here where I live in Colorado. And their populations have declined by over 80%, primarily from conversion of prairie ecosystems to agricultural lands. So let's say in this scenario, I'm working for an organization that I have deemed Plover Lovers, Inc. And we have identified a key nesting area for mountain plovers in southeast Colorado. So Plover Lovers is planning to conduct outreach to the community to engage them in conservation, and we need to know where to invest our limited resources. Next slide, Kai. So using this tool, I can select my area of interest. And so let's say that these three rectangles in red in southeast Colorado have been identified as really critical areas to engage folks in bird conservation. So after I select my areas of interest, I can explore just a few results on this initial interface. There is a much more involved and detailed report you can get to later, but I'll just go through a few of the metrics that are available right off the bat. So after selecting my area of these three counties, I can explore a few different metrics like income, median household income, the percent of people identifying as a minority, the percent of people that speak English less than very well, the percent of families below the poverty line, and more. So just from this initial interface, a few things stick out to me. So Prowers County has a higher median household income than the other two. However, all three of these, sorry, can you go back, Kai? All three of these are below the median household income for the United States. Prowers and Bend counties, thank you, are over 40% minority, while Baca County is around 16%. So this could tell me that more bi or multilingual approaches could be useful in Prowers County. And the higher proportion of people in Bent County living below the poverty line could mean that residents there may have other needs that must be met before they can be engaged in conservation. For example, and sorry, you can go to the next slide. So this is where more bilingual or multilingual approaches might be useful, seeing these differences in how folks speak English well or less than very well. And this last one here is showing that folks in Bent County have a higher proportion of folks families living below the poverty level, about 21% compared to 11 or 14% in the other counties. So using just these initial metrics, you can determine, maybe there are some additional things needed here. We need to provide resources or remove barriers so we can engage folks in conservation in our mountain plover work. Okay, next slide. So that's just really the tip of the iceberg. But when you select an area to look at, you can download a full report in either PDF or Excel. And this table of contents here on the left shows you some of the examples of things that are in the report. And I would recommend downloading in Excel because you can actually manipulate the figures and say if you want to pull out a graph, you can remove extraneous information. So for example, I pulled this employment by industry graph for our mountain plover example, and then I removed all but the top three industries, which are government, farm, and retail trade, with government being the top line in light blue. So anecdotally, I would have thought that farming would have been the #1 industry in this area. But looking at this graph, I see that government is actually the largest industry, and this could open pathways for government partnerships that might not be successful in areas where distrust of government is prevalent. So just some interesting ways to look at the socioeconomic conditions of the areas in which you work to target outreach, to improve private lands conservation, to assist with planning. Plenty of applications, and highly recommend you check it out. The next tool that I'd like to share with you is our Engagement Wayfinder, and this is available on fws.gov. It really serves as a primer to stakeholder engagement, and there's a lot of resources you can dive into to learn more. So when you get to the homepage, there's this interactive path graphic that you can click on to navigate around. We have an initial page of the general benefits and challenges of stakeholder and partner engagement. And then you can navigate to the framework, which the entire tool is built around the International Association for Public Participation's spectrum of engagement, which has engagement on a spectrum, of course, from inform to empower. And at the inform level, it's a one-way flow of information, whereas empower on the other end of the spectrum, we're really empowering citizens in the decision-making and implementing what they decide. And if you explore this part here, you can expand all of the different levels of the spectrum to see what exactly are you promising to the public when you're engaging at this level, and what are considerations you need to take into account in order to engage folks at that level. The tool also has a variety of techniques that are based on the level of engagement you need, and guidelines for conducting a situation analysis, which can help determine whether a process is even necessary for stakeholder engagement, and if so, what type of process might respond to the needs of both the public and your organization. We also have compendiums of case studies to learn from others that have engaged in public engagement processes, and then resources galore. So I mentioned this is really a primer to get you thinking about how you might engage with folks, but there are entire books and toolkits out there, and we've collected a wide variety of resources that you can use. So I mentioned being able to explore examples of application can be really valuable for connecting the dots and making conservation social science feel a little bit less nebulous. So NABC has actually put together a great collection of success stories about humans and birds. And next slide, Kai. These range the gamut from how we can change dog owner behavior to conserve piping plovers, how we can understand different tools that we can use to engage landowners to conserve habitats, understanding the relationship between birds and landowners, purple martin success dependent on human behavior. And then lastly, I know we have some Fly Lakes folks in the room, but landowner survey changes their approach to playa conservation based on human dimensions research. So definitely invite you to check that out. There's a lot of really great examples that show how social science has been applied to birds. And then HDGov is an interagency website that it's a global source for social science information about interactions between people and the environment. So this website is a collaborative effort between USGS, the Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, EPA, NASA, Northern Michigan University, and a whole other slew of folks. And it's really to serve as a central repository of social science information related to conservation. So there are resources like citations and abstracts, different tools like some of the ones I mentioned on this presentation, different social science methods, and laws and policies. You can find instructor-led or on-demand archived training opportunities if you want to watch something or listen to a podcast. And then there's also a job board. So any relevant human dimensions or social science jobs are posted there. So it's a great resource for students, professors, folks working in different roles. There's just a lot of information on HDGov. And then lastly, if this has piqued your interest and you'd like to learn more, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service offers a course through the National Conservation Training Center called Human Dimensions Foundations. And we will be diving into an overview of key disciplines, methods, and practical applications, including some of the things we briefly mentioned today, like human-wildlife conflict, behavior change, public engagement, and strategic communication. Our next offering is TBD on the date and location, but we will have a course in 2024. So keep a lookout for courses in the Human Dimensions content area from the National Conservation Training Center. And that's all we have.
Thank you both so much for your presentation and also just your outstanding work for integration of social science and in conservation efforts really across the board. Are there any pressing questions right now that anyone has before I jump into our integration step-by-step guide? I'm going to keep moving for the sake of time, and I will pause again for questions once I finish this next stretch. So it's a great build off of my present button. Here we go. All of the information you just heard and all of those outstanding resources, I will be sure, sorry, I got backwards here. My little bird again, there we go. I'll be sure to share in a follow-up email. And then this tool that I'm presenting now was co-designed with Kayandra and Emily and many others who participate in the NABC Human Dimensions Subcommittee. And so many of the tools that were highlighted just now are linked in this document as well. So you'll have multiple ways to access them following today's meeting. So one of the questions that I get a lot is where to start. So I think we're to a point now in the bird conservation world where there is general, at least from my perspective, and maybe people are humoring me, but it seems as though there's general buy-in across the board that we need conservation social science to recover tipping point bird species. And there's energy and there's excitement around doing that. But then the question is, okay, I'm bought in, I agree, we need it. How do I do it? How do we start? Where do we start? And what are the steps? And so the NABC Human Dimensions Subcommittee has been working on creating a document for a while now, a couple years of work by a lot of people to provide you with steps to doing just that. And so it's a 10-page guide that, again, it's on the NABC website now, but I'll share it directly with you in an email following this session. That's a guide to incorporating social science in bird conservation. And we've put together as much information in a condensed package as possible. The target audience for this guide are not social scientists. They're people who are working in bird conservation from other disciplines who, like I said, agree and have bought into the idea that human dimensions work is needed and are ready to start doing it. And not that you have to be the one to do the conservation social science research project, but in working through what and how to implement. So what I'm going to do briefly here is just run you through what's included in the document so that when you access it later, you're already oriented to its contents. And then I'm happy to answer any questions now or as a follow-up to in the tools and the contents that are included. So as was mentioned, our document starts out with what conservation social scientists really believe is foundational to moving forward and doing human dimensions work well. And that's understanding that there's a difference between human dimensions and conservation social science. And Kayandra and Emily both talked about all of this, so I'm not going to go into the details in general here, but this guide also outlines for you the differences there and when you should use each term and why sometimes it can be confusing when we're using them interchangeably. So human dimensions is anything related to conservation that is not wildlife and is not habitats. And if you're tossing that around in your head, you probably think, well, it's hard to separate all of those things. And yes, yes, it is. So I would argue that human dimensions is really relevant to all of conservation because we can't really operate with conserving habitats or conserving wildlife in most places on our planet without engaging humans and without thinking about human dimensions. And our guide breaks human dimensions into two categories, which you also just saw as well, engagement and research. And those things are different. To do good, productive human dimensions work, you do not always need to be doing novel research. You can be focusing on engagement. You can be focusing on partnership building. It doesn't have to be a full-fledged social science research project. But there are ways that research can help answer human dimensions questions. And I'm not going into all of them here. The guide does that in a condensed way for you. And those are follow-up conversations that I would love to have with anybody as well. And then the same for conservation social science. You'll see this figure in the guide that outlines some of the most relevant fields of conservation social science for bird conservation. And I think it's important to acknowledge that just as a biologist has a specialty area, a social scientist has a specialty area. One of us does not do all of these things. And so when you're trying to think about engagement with social scientists or incorporation of social scientists into your species working group, any social scientist may not do the trick, right? You may need somebody with a particular area of expertise and who falls into one of these particular fields. Ideally, you have someone from all of these fields, but you have to prioritize your needs, which I'll talk about in a minute. That's something that I can help the species working groups to do as well, and then to help connect with social scientists who are in the most appropriate and most productive field for where the species working group is. So the guide goes into a deeper dive with these two ideas of engagement and research. The blue bullets here you see under engagement are links in the document to engagement tools that exist. And so you just saw some of those. I think the different phases of engagement are really important, particularly the pieces that highlight what are you promising to the public when you are doing engagement and public engagement? What's your purpose? And there's a time and a place for all levels of engagement with the public. They think acknowledging where you are and being transparent with your intent when doing public engagement is really very important for having buy-in and to having participation that's sustainable throughout a conservation project. The guide also breaks research into these different topics. And again, you could have an endless list of research topics that are related to conservation and to human dimensions and to bird conservation most specifically. But these are the ones that our NABC Human Dimensions Subcommittee has pulled out as being particularly relevant to bird conservation. And in the guide, you'll see a further explanation as well as links to some resources for these different research topics. So the part of the guide that I'm most excited about, and I think many of you will be most excited about, is that we do provide a step-by-step guide to incorporating human dimensions into conservation strategies. And this guide was, it has gone through a lot of evolutions. The purpose of this guide is to incorporate human dimensions work into conservation action. And so as a social scientist, when I meet with species working groups and when I think about the challenges and the threats that tipping point bird species are facing, my mind starts spinning with conservation social science research questions that I think are fascinating and very important to answer. But our guide is not really focused on diving into those interest areas of conservation social science research. It's more action oriented. And so when we're thinking about conservation strategy, what can we actually be doing on the ground? How do we go about incorporating human dimensions into those efforts? And so it's in two phases. Phase one of this step-by-step guide. So it's a 12-step guide. I might prove myself wrong in a couple minutes. I think it's a 12-step guide. Phase one focuses on what you need to know to successfully integrate human dimensions into your work. So what's the background legwork that a species working group can do before approaching a conservation social scientist, an engagement expert, a communications specialist on working on incorporating human dimensions into your work? So we've outlined, and again, you'll get access to this full document shortly. List your major conservation priorities, the threats, and any pressures that the species is facing. Identify the human elements contributing and influencing those threats, and explore examples of where conservation, social science, and human dimensions have been implemented with regards to relevant threats. And what I like to point out here is that we do have lots of success stories related to bird conservation, but we're in need of a lot more. So we can also look outside of bird conservation, because fortunately for us as practitioners, but unfortunately for wildlife species, a lot of the same threats that impact birds impact other species, or the same geographies where we're having critical bird conservation issues are critical geographies for other conservation issues as well. So broaden our thinking and look for examples that are relevant to the species working group. They might not be exactly on target, but that are relevant, where lessons learned may be applicable and may give us a starting point for integrating human dimensions into our species working group conservation actions. So once you do that, you'll be able to develop your initial list of human dimensions in conservation social science questions. And you'll notice so far in this guide, I have not asked you to do any social science work independently yet, right? This is the background legwork before you approach collaborators, so that you have some guidance, you have some specific asks, and then back to that diagram of all the different specialty areas and the wheel that was shown earlier, some context of exactly where you need to go, what types of experts do you need. And then step 5 is to find a conservation social scientist to collaborate with. And that's hard, right? That's a task that is not easy. So we've given you some places to start. And the first one on there is our subcommittee. So myself, I'm one of the co-chairs of the subcommittee. It's a very active subcommittee of conservation social scientists. And I will say as well, not everyone on the subcommittee is a conservation social scientist. We have many biologists, ecologists on the committee who I refer to as social science champions, right? So people who are working hard to integrate social science, even though they themselves are not a social scientist. So that's my plug for, if you're interested in these topics, consider joining the Human Dimensions subcommittee and helping us engage in these important conversations. There's a list of other places, Wildlife Society, AFWA, Conservation Social Sciences. These groups have social science working groups or listservs that you can connect with to find people with areas of expertise that relate and would support the work of your species working group. This is another area where I can help as well. So please reach out when you're ready for step number 5. Then we move into phase 2, which is how to move forward and put human dimensions work into practice. And so there's more steps here to review with a conservation social science expert or a human dimensions expert the information that you've learned in the first phases, the relevant case studies you found, the work that might be interesting, the lessons learned that may be relevant. And then you have to have a conversation about prioritizing the purpose of the human dimensions work for where you are in terms of species recovery for your working group. Human dimensions topics are all intertwined. They're all complex. It's hard to pull out, oh, this is the human dimensions issue, but we can prioritize them. And so conversations amongst your species working group and by incorporating human dimensions specialists and conservation social scientists can help you to prioritize what may be most productive to start. Then you create a plan, you implement. We think about social variables to monitor, just like you monitor ecological variables. One plug for social monitoring is that a lot of times we see social indicators a lot faster than we can see biological or ecological indicators of success from the social science perspective, at least amongst people. People are generally pretty quick to let you know when something is not working, but you have to be listening. You have to have a tool and a way to be gathering that input as you proceed with your conservation actions. How do you know if your plan is working? And I think these conversations are really important from the social science perspective and the biological perspective. Is how are we measuring success? How are we monitoring it? And where can we connect our variables from the social and the biological side so that we're getting holistic and integrated data back about how we're doing with species recovery? And then you do the work and you continually reflect on if you have the right team to be doing this work. Who else do you need? What perspectives are missing from the table, from your group? Where can you improve your outreach, your communication, and ultimately your impact to the bird species? Evaluate your results and share your results. Emily just showed you a few of the stories that are highlighted on the NABC Success Story website. We are always looking for more. So if you have a success story of integrating human dimensions into bird recovery, and again, it doesn't have to mean that you successfully recovered the species, right? There are many stages of success along the way. We would love to hear about those. We would love to feature them and build that success story website, because those are all good places to go for that lesson learned step, which in step 3 of this guide. And then plan and adapt. Adaptive management works across the board for biological efforts, for social science efforts. How can you improve funding? If you have funding, how can you extend it? How can you expand it? So having all of those conversations. The guide lays out all of these steps, and then it provides you with further resources for diving into them. So it wraps up with examples of human dimensions and conservation success, achieving conservation goals. And we have a list of resources and further readings included in that guide as well, for those who are interested in expanding their background knowledge in the fields. I think we have it broken down as human dimensions, conservation social science, and then specific social science related to bird conservation. I'm going to stop there for now. And I will pause for just a couple minutes and see if there are any questions that anyone has related to that integration guide that I just shared, or from the introductory talk that Kendra and Emily provided a few minutes ago.
You do have a question in the chat.
Thank you. Get it. Are success stories from outside the US included? I'm going to blank off the top of my head as which countries are represented, but yes, the page is hosted on the US NABC website, and it is focused on North American birds, but as we all know, birds don't stay in one place. And so yes, we do have examples of migratory bird conservation that include areas outside the US. We would love more, and Road to Recovery is putting a lot of effort into international collaborations and how we can support migratory birds across the flyways. Esmeralda Bravo is on the call. She is the Road to Recovery International Graduate Fellow, and a lot of her work is focusing on highlighting these examples as well. So if you have more of them, anyone on this call, we would love to connect with you and highlight those both. I'm speaking on behalf of both NABC and Road to Recovery in that sense. Other questions from these first two? I hope that you found them helpful. It's a lot of information, but I think that having the time to orient ourselves to the language that we're using, the theories that we're using in this field as a whole is important in going into our next phase of this meeting, which features some case studies and success stories that relate to these different disciplines. Perfect. Well, I guess I'll take some credit that we're right on time, which is awesome. So we're going to move forward. Oh, we have one more. We'll get one more. Is there a compiled list of social science public funding opportunities? Michelle, that is a fantastic question. There is not that I know of. Kendra or Emily, do either of you know of one that exists? It is something that I have started working on. And it is in baby stages, but it's something that we would like to be able to host on the Road to Recovery website, and social science funding opportunities, but also integrated conservation funding opportunities. And where can we go to find funding and funders who are excited about projects that do both, right? That include social science and include human dimensions while working on filling biological knowledge gaps related to tipping point species. So again, I'll just keep plugging for public assistance on these projects. I have started that list, and if you have funding opportunities or resources that could be useful to include on that list, please send them my way, and I would love to add them. Once completed, it will be housed on the Road to Recovery website, but we'll try to link it across the board with NABC partners in flight and other partners as well. Great, so moving into the next portion of our meeting, we have 4 outstanding, what I'm calling flash talks, but quick case study examples of successes of conservation, social science, and human dimensions work in bird conservation. So I'll start by introducing Dr. Jason Hoeksema, who is a professor of biology at the University of Mississippi and president of Delta Wind Birds, which is a nonprofit dedicated to fostering stopover habitat for migratory shorebirds in the Mississippi Delta. Dr. Hoeksema received his PhD in ecology from the University of California, Davis in 2002, and he held positions as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and as a postdoctoral fellow at the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center at Duke University. I am a Tar Heel, I bleed Carolina blue, but I will give you props for that awesome postdoctoral fellowship anyways. All of that before joining the University of Mississippi in 2007. So Dr. Hoeksema's research focuses on the ecological, evolutionary, and ecosystem consequences of interactions among species, especially involving plants, fungi, and what we are all most interested in is migratory birds. Jason, thank you so much for being here, and I will turn over control to you.
Thanks a lot, Katie. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'll share my screen. And hopefully you can all see that.
Yes, looks good. Thank you.
So our work focuses on the lower Mississippi alluvial plain, or what we call the Delta in this area. And it's been estimated that more than 500,000 migratory shorebirds pass through this region each year, stopping over to feed during their journeys, and some of them wintering there. 27 or so species are included, and one of the main conservation problems that we've identified that we can potentially help to address is limited shorebird stopover habitat in this region, especially in the fall when it tends to be really dry on the landscape. Delta Windbirds is a small nonprofit that we founded about 10 years ago to address this issue, to work with private landowners to try to provide temporary stopover habitat on working lands. Our first example was on a working hunting club where it's a former catfish farm where the landowners have been really interested in learning how to manage their impoundments for shorebird habitat. And that has worked really well. The landowners have really grown to love what they're doing, and they're getting better and better at it every year. We hold outreach events there at their place. And we've learned a lot and had great success there and been able to build on that. But a few years ago, we sought to address this question, which is whether we could make fall shorebird habitat in this region on crop fields, but without pumping groundwater. Groundwater depletion is a growing issue in the Mississippi Delta, and we wanted to not contribute to that issue, but while still providing migratory shorebird habitat. So we found a partner farmer, mainly by working through NRCS staff in the area who had themselves been working with farmers to implement tailwater recovery systems on farms with mainly putting in return ditches and on-site reservoirs to recycle surface water and allow it to be reused for pumping for irrigation. And we found through them, we found a farmer who was willing to try pumping some of that excess surface water back out onto his fields after the harvest of his crops in the fall. And we focused on corn because it's harvested earlier. This farmer's name is James Failing, and we undertook a study for 3 years to compare 3 flooded fields versus 3 unflooded fields on his farm, and this was alternated a couple of different sites on the farm across these years. Our overarching hypothesis was that temporary wetlands on these crop fields may benefit wildlife, farms, and ecosystems, and perhaps people in additional ways through creation of bird habitat, soil conservation, and perhaps denitrification, which is microbial activity that takes excess nitrogen out of the water and pumps it into the air before it has a chance to run off and contribute to downstream eutrophication issues. So just briefly, we found that this approach attracted tons of birds, and there was really no question about that right from the beginning. We also found, interestingly, a lot of beneficial microbial activity, especially at the beginning of the flooding in the fall when it was still warm outside. This is a benefit that we think is not found to such a degree in winter flooding in this region, which is really quite a common management practice for waterfowl. So fall flooding for shorebirds during warm weather may have more of this kind of beneficial microbial activity. We also found benefits for soil conservation. So flooded fields are in the green dots, and they do not lose sediment at nearly the rate during rain events as we see being lost from unflooded fields. Most interestingly, and a really welcome surprise, was that the farmers was seeing about a 4 or 5% increase in crop yield on his soybeans in the flooded fields compared to the unflooded fields. And we saw this, it's actually 3 years in a row now. So that was a great surprise. Now, as a next step in this work, we used some of those data as preliminary data for a grant proposal to the EPA. And that grant is a partnership now between the University of Mississippi, the USDA ARS, Mississippi State University and Extension, and Delta Windbirds. And in this project, we're working on 10 farm sites across the Sunflower River Basin, implementing these treatments, passive flooding with only water control structures stopped up to catch rainfall, fall flood only, winter flood only, and both fall and winter fields. And we're looking at corn and soybean rotations to answer all kinds of different questions in this system to follow up on our previous results. One thing, though, is that expanding like this required recruiting more farmers to participate. So I spent a lot of time a few summers ago on the phone, first of all, with farmers, and then driving around the Mississippi Delta to meet with potentially interested farmers to participate in the project and trying to explain to them what we were trying to do. The project will also include, continue to include farmer outreach projects, field days at farms, and networking. I wanted to mention what we have found so far with trying to recruit farmers and to expand out in the scale of what we're doing across additional farms in the region. One thing is that right from the beginning, there are some farmers who will not, at least initially, participate due to various concerns about flooding their fields. Here's a partial list of those concerns that I accumulated after talking with so many farmers. One is that it takes valuable time away from harvesting and field prep activities. In our region, trying to create habitat in September during the peak of shorebird migration, that's when crop harvesting is happening. So even if our fields might have been harvested, it's really tough to get the farmers to ask them to stop, to not continue to work on harvesting all of their other crops and to take time from that to work on flooding our fields and making habitat. There are farmer concerns that the flooding would erode the beds that they have already prepped, which they like to do in the fall before the winter hits. There's some concern over stubble drift, which can interfere with planting. There was concern about potentially the fields being too wet, even wetter than usual, to get into those fields in the spring for planting. There was concern that it would harden soil, which would impede planting or reduce yield. And there was concern about this flooding treatment, quote unquote, locking up phosphorus and reducing yield. Now, our farmer has that we've been working with from the beginning in 2018 has found that none of these issues are significant for him. And he's been really valuable in talking with other farmers at some of our outreach events, just explaining his perspective on this and why this or that issue has not been a problem for him. And he can answer questions. And that just having one person like that who is on board, who's part of the farmer community, has been super valuable in starting to, dispel some of these concerns among other farmers in the area. A second finding in this area is that some farmers will participate, but they don't prioritize flooding very soon after the crop harvest. So they sign a contract, they say they will make habitat as soon as possible after their crop harvest, but we tried to keep the contracts flexible for them. But then what we found is that weeks went by and they don't want to stop harvesting their crops and take time to make habitat. So we found this year some improvement in that area, especially after we strategically started doing a couple of things this past summer. One was with one of my graduate students, having a series of face-to-face meetings with all of our participating farmers to make sure that they really understand why we're doing what we're doing, showing them lists and photos of some of the birds that were visiting their farms, talking about why it's important to flood early in the fall because it's the peak of shorebird migration, and really just making sure they're on board with and understanding why we're trying to do what we're trying to do, rather than just having phone calls about their contract or asking them if they've been able to flood on time yet. Secondly, we also restructured our farmer contracts this year to try to reward early flooding, so that each week earlier that they flood means a higher payment per acre of flooded habitat. And both of those things have really worked well. It's variable, but pretty successful. We're still learning, and I'm excited to learn from this session today about how we might further build real social science into some of these efforts as we go forward. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thanks, Jason. That's really exciting to hear and is absolutely real social science. So you're doing it, and it's really exciting to see those results and how you've been able to be adaptive. We look forward to following Delta Windbirds as well and learning more as you all continue to grow and learn. If you have questions for Jason, please feel free to put them in the chat or write them down. We're going to move through our 4 presentations and then take questions for the group at the end. But if you want to not let them leave your brain, go ahead and put them in the chat now, and we'll gather them all together after the 4 presentations. So our next flash talk is given by Katya Carranza. Katya is a sustainability organizer and researcher focused on improving the reciprocal interconnections between people and nature, while increasing equity for underserved communities. For over 10 years, Katya has directed transdisciplinary initiatives focused on advancing the environmental and social vision of her communities through work in grassroots, academia, government, and nonprofits. Katya, thank you for being here. I will turn over control to you for your talk.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you all the other presenters. It has been really great to learn more about all the work that's happening. I'm going to share my screen right now. So like was mentioned, I am a sustainability researcher and community organizer, and I'm going to be presenting an example for upholding equity and activism to advance social ecological research and resilience of people of color and underserved communities. Oh, sorry, can y'all see the presentation?
We can, yes.
I don't. It like. I don't know what happened. Okay. Is it good now?
Yeah, we can see your first slide. It looks like we're still seeing like your internet tab. So I don't know,
Oh,
like a view.
I don't know what's happening. What about now?
We're still seeing it, but we're on the title slide.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna do this another way then. Sorry, this has worked in the
It's
past.
okay. It always works every time, except when you have everyone watching you.
I'm just gonna, what about now?
We're still seeing the same. You could try to unshare it and just start it over. Maybe it froze.
Oh, it says your screen sharing is paused. Okay.
I'm the worst help because technology is certainly not my thing. That's it. We're seeing social and environmental interconnections.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to present an example for upholding equity and activism to advance social ecological research and resilience of underserved people. And I'm going to describe how my research has been developed and implemented in order to support community priorities and advance scientific ecology and conservation norms. So this framework was greatly shaped by my experience as a mestiza immigrant and community organizer for environmental and climate justice and immigrant rights. So I have personally experienced how social and environmental exploitation are connected. After I graduated from college, I returned to my hometown, and in a hometown that is majority immigrant and people of color. And I learned that we have a decommissioned nuclear plant, coal ash ponds, Superfund sites, and carcinogenic ethylene oxide. And so seeing this injustice, I quickly became an organizer, for environmental and immigrant rights. And through this experience, I saw how the health and labor and land of my communities was being exploited in order to advance the interest of corporations. Not to mention that when I returned to my hometown in Mexico, I learned that my family lived in the industrial part of the city, and we were being polluted by Western companies. So with my background, I entered graduate school to prepare to advance the social and environmental priorities of people of color and underserved communities. And so I wanted to advance systemic change for equity and sustainability. I wanted to do research to support the priorities of communities. And I did not just want to focus on research that was only focused on answering scientific questions or current ecological or conservation issues. Because I know my communities have been historically excluded from these fields. And so our values and priorities are not very much represented in solutions. So thankfully, I was able to work with my advisors that have done a lot of work in grasslands and social ecological resilience and complexity. And so I was able to bring the systems perspective I had from my background, and I paired it with academic research on social ecological systems. And so for that reason, my graduate research is focused on advancing and supporting the social ecological resilience and relationships of Indigenous people and their grasslands. And so this work is founded on the idea that Indigenous resilience is essential to Native social ecological relationships and resilience, because for thousands of years, Indigenous people have harnessed and managed their sacred interconnections with their communities and ecosystems. So these Indigenous interactions are ancestral and keystone processes that shaped resilience and social ecological systems, as well as grasslands. So after drafting my proposal, I connected with Indigenous leaders and organizations to see if the research proposal and my graduate time could serve their priorities. So I met Indigenous leaders in the Indigenous Kinship Circle, which is the grassland community across Turtle Island, North America, focused on kinship and connection and education. And we identified how my research could support their work. So for 2 years, we have been collaborating on advancing the research and shaping it to support Indigenous people, perspectives, priorities, and resilience in the Northern Great Plains. And we have also obtained scientific advice from my graduate committee members that are also Indigenous and part of the IKC. So through surveys, I'm assessing how Indigenous people interact with, access, and value social and ecosystem services, in addition to their barriers to these services, because we want to center their social ecological resilience. And I'm also supplementing the survey with interviews that will assess how Indigenous people understand social processes impacting their interactions, as well as how they would like the processes to change. So, and this QR code and the bit.ly is for the survey, and we're currently implementing if you know anyone that could qualify for it. So this research will help inform the IKC efforts so that they can better support the social and environmental relationships and priorities of Indigenous people. It will identify barriers that need to be removed to support the priorities and resilience of Indigenous people as well. And we're going to create results we're going to share results and reports so that Native nations and communities can use them to advocate for their social and environmental priorities. So the other part of my research is focused on supporting my advisors' research and assessing the grassland management in the Sandhills of Nebraska. So we did an experiment to compare pyrrhic herbivory and rotational grazing and to assess the impact of these practices on grassland resilience. So I conducted vegetation and bird surveys over the summer of 2022. And we're currently assessing how the management systems impacted the heterogeneity and biodiversity of Barta Brothers Ranch. And we're looking at these two factors because they're key indicators of grassland resilience, as well as, like has been mentioned, grassland birds are threatened. So I conducted the ecological research through the lens of how these management practices are tied to ancestral Indigenous social ecological practices, especially considering how rotational grazing and pyrrhic herbivory have been employed by Indigenous people throughout the world. So I'm still analyzing the results for my research, but they are interconnected because they focus on how the resilience of Indigenous people and their practices are essential for advancing the resilience of grasslands. So this research can serve as an example for upholding equity and activism to advance social ecological research and resilience of people in underserved communities, of people of color in underserved communities, because the understanding and priorities of these communities set the foundation and goals of this work. The project recognized how social ecological resilience cannot be achieved in grasslands if all communities do not have resilience, because the health of our communities, wildlife, and environments are inherently tied. In addition, the work was advanced upholding how Indigenous people and practices shaped the resilience of grasslands. And since the project was shaped by recognizing these interconnections, this entailed recognizing how ecology and conservation are often inspired by Indigenous knowledges and practices. And we are supportive that Indigenous people should be involved and have ownership over their ancestral knowledge and practices when they're being used and studied. And so this research has been advanced through equitable collaboration, and we have prioritized working with our community members to advance their priorities as we navigate the often strict practices and policies of academia. So, and overall, we have been working for assessing how our people, wildlife, and environments are being exploited by the same force. We want to provide information that can be used to create equitable solutions to mitigate the interconnected exploitation, so we can advance resilience of people, wildlife, and environments. So that was it.
Thank you, Katya. It's so great to hear about your work. For both you and Jason, my 7 to 10 minute ask was just not sufficient. So would love to hear more about all of these projects. It's such awesome work. And I think you mentioned that you bring the systems perspective to this work. And I think that's so important and what we really truly need across the board for bird conservation. So thank you for sharing. If you have questions for Katya, same thing, write them down or feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll pause for questions once we finish the last two of our Flash Talk case study examples. So I'll introduce next Sammy Livingston. Sammy is a graduate student at Virginia Tech in the Dare Human Dimensions Lab, which is also where I am housed for my employment at Virginia Tech, where she works on a transdisciplinary project aimed at preventing human disturbance to shorebirds along the Atlantic Flyway. Her research focuses on integrating strategic communications and behavioral change strategies into conservation practices. Sammy, thanks so much for being here. I will hand controls over to you now.
Cool, thank you, Katie. So hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I'm just going to be giving a brief overview of the collaborative project I'm involved in, where we're reducing human disturbance to shorebirds through behavior change strategies and promoting voluntary compliance. So this primarily involves integrating strategic communication strategies into our shorebird conservation plans. And it can be really challenging to know how to communicate with the public in ways that are meaningful, easy to understand, and promote behavior change. And in a project like the one I'm going to be talking about today, it's really necessary to do this effectively and know how to do it, because human actions are directly and indirectly contributing to the worldwide decline of shorebird populations. So these negative human interactions are commonly referred to as human disturbance. So disturbance occurs when an individual bird or a group of birds are forced to change their normal behavior as a result of human activity. And this prevents shorebirds from doing things that they otherwise would be doing in the absence of humans. So things like feeding, nesting, and resting. And this is important to address because on the Atlantic coast in the US, land managers have rated human disturbance as the leading threat facing shorebirds. And this is a threat that's expected to continue to rise as coastal areas become more populated and developed, leading to increased interactions between people and shorebirds. So from a management perspective, this can be really overwhelming to address because we often think from a biological lens, and we might not know how to positively integrate the role of people into these scenarios. So as social scientists, we try to think of win-win management strategies that allow birds and people to exist within these spaces. So to do that, we need to prioritize strategic communication and behavior change strategies to kind of create outcomes that benefit both birds and people. So, however, disturbance is commonly managed through regulatory signs and strategies that communicate and enforce the rules of the beach. So while these can be really helpful and they're often necessary to communicate rules, managers acknowledge that regulatory measures alone aren't really effective at promoting behavior change, because people are more likely to comply with something when they know the reason for that rule, or they make that choice themselves. So we can kind of integrate social science and strategic communication to make our efforts more engaging in ways that promote voluntary compliance. And voluntary compliance essentially means that people are choosing to engage in a behavior or follow a rule from their own free will. So this can be a super useful strategy to promote if you have like capacity limitations and you can't monitor people all the time. And it also works to create long-term change because we're using strategies that engage people in conservation behaviors and allow them to kind of come to their own conclusions about positive things that they can choose to do. So often these strategies take the form of education, signage, and outreach. And all of them aim to kind of just go beyond providing factual information to your audience and communicate your project goals, objectives, and messages in very clear and compelling ways. And your resources and capabilities may influence which strategies you choose to implement. So I'm going to give 2 examples from our project that our partners implemented. The first one will be a sign that may be more feasible to implement, and then a community outreach event that may require more resources. But incorporating a variety of different strategies is often the best way to change behavior. So our first example is signage. So if we take a look at this sign, we can acknowledge that there's probably a lot of really important information here, but you can't really identify the main takeaway of the sign at first glance. So if we put ourselves in the mindset of our target audience, so maybe they're really excited, they have a dog with them, they have their family, they want to go out and play in the sand, they have a lot of things in their hands, they're really hot. All of these are likely, they're not likely going to read this sign, right? When they have other objectives. So as managers, we need to kind of ask ourselves, what am I trying to communicate and what do I want my audience to do? And then the answers to these questions need to be very clear in our communication and our signage. So an example of this is this no dog sign that our partners in New York created for one of their behavior change strategies. So immediately you can kind of identify the message that no dog should be at this site. And then what do you want your audience to do? Ideally, you want them to bring their dog somewhere else. So here in the bottom right of the sign is a QR code that links to dog-friendly sites in the area that people can take their pet to instead. Then additionally, these signs are being placed where behavior change is needed. So in the parking lot before people even go onto the beach, on trail entrances, on walking paths, so that people can just be reminded of the message instead of not only reading it at the beach entrance and then forgetting about it later or just not even seeing it in general. And then another way to promote voluntary compliance is through community outreach. So again, we're asking ourselves, what am I trying to communicate and what do I want my audience to do? So at this event hosted by our partners in Georgia, the event name very clearly conveys what they're trying to communicate, that dogs should be on leash at this beach to help wildlife. And then what do they want their audience to do? They want them to leash their dog. So at this event, they actually provided leashes to all the attendees that had that message written on the leash so that they could hand them out and kind of engage the community in this behavior and then eliminate that barrier and give them something so that they can participate in pro-shorebird behaviors. So communication can really take many different forms and it can be fun and creative. But acknowledging that it's also not as easy as it sounds, and it can be a learning process to shift your communication styles. So as one of our partners said, they found themselves struggling between being the scientist that needs to provide all of the information and then simplifying the message so that it's impactful. And that's a learning process, and it can take a lot of different people to kind of look at something from different lenses. So to end, I kind of want to provide you with some just key communication takeaways that we discussed that can help you assess your current outreach or develop new outreach in the future. So the first, having a clear and simple message that quickly conveys what you're trying to say and what you want people to do. So providing information should always be followed by some sort of ask. So if you're saying that no dogs should be on the beach, what's the alternative? So please bring them to a nearby dog-friendly site instead. And then even though we want to convey all of the important things about our work, that's likely not going to stick with people. So going beyond providing facts and engaging people in something that's rememberable, whether that's a colorful sign with really good graphics, a guided bird walk, or something else. And then place messages where the behavior change needs to occur. People forget, they don't know what situations require behavior change, especially on beaches when it all looks like sand sometimes. So you can help them out by communicating your message in places where it's needed, just so that people are remembering. And then lastly, it can be really helpful to create a list of talking points or write down your main message and what your ask is, and give that to your staff, your technicians, volunteers, partners, and people who may be quoted in a press release or talking to a news outlet. This just helps ensure that your message stays consistent, that you have your key takeaways consistently across everyone and everybody's on the same page. So thanks so much for listening. We'd like to extend our gratitude to our long-term funders and our partners, and then most of all, our collaborators and the folks on the ground who make all of this work possible. My email is listed here. Feel free to reach out with any questions, and I'm always happy to help through communication and different messages.
Thanks so much, Sammy, and thanks for that offer to be a resource as well. Your work is awesome. It's been so much fun for me to follow it as it moves along. And I think that quote you had in there about the pull of being a scientist and wanting to explain everything and then trying to think about, well, what do people really need to know, is so important in social science and in marketing and communications, but also when you're thinking about community engagement and partnership building as well. Great job, Sammy. Thanks for participating. One more time, if you have questions for Sammy, go ahead and jot them down so they don't leave your mind, and we'll come back to questions for all of our presenters in just a few minutes. So our fourth talk, I'd like to introduce Steve Jester, who's the Executive Director of Partnerscapes, which is a landowner-led organization that works on the communication and relationship-focused aspects of sustaining our national landscapes for both people and nature. Steve lives in Texas, which my 5-year-old son would describe as the way best state ever, and has worked with private landowners in all aspects of conservation for 30 years. Steve, thanks so much for joining us. I have your presentation, so I'll go ahead and pull those up.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to share some time with you today. I'm going to a little bit change of pace. I'm going to share more of a story than anything else, sort of the implementation or the art of human dimensions and social aspects of natural resource management. To do that, I'm going to enlist the help of a fellow that's going to be at the Road to Recovery Conference this January. So if he tells you anything different from his story than I tell you, certainly he is the one that walked the walk and lived it. So for sure, he's got his facts straight. This is Russell Davis from Carville, Colorado. Russell, 20 years ago, was not a plover lover by any means. So he wasn't really a plover hater. He really didn't know what a plover was, and that's what he'll tell you. He was and is still a rancher in southeastern Colorado, multi-generational ranch. They didn't prior to his experience with the mountain plover, they didn't partner with government agencies. They didn't think about a whole lot of things other than ranching and rangelands management. Next slide. Russell, one day, as Russell will tell you, he was introduced to the mountain plover, and the way he was introduced to it was there was a researcher that was out in the field. They were sort of shotgunning the place, not really with a shotgun, but going out all over the place trying to find where the plovers were nesting. And Russell saw it in his binoculars out in the field, a pickup truck, one day in a prairie dog town, and didn't think much of it because neighbors came over and hunted prairie dogs from time to time, and he wasn't really concerned about it until the next day. He looked up and the same truck was over in the same place. So Russell went over to see what was going on. And long story made short, a researcher, a technician with the university had found her way onto Russell's property by mistake. She thought she was on another ranch, but she had found the mother lode of plovers, and she proceeded to tell Russell that he had them everywhere. He had them everywhere. She was beyond excited. And Russell didn't even know what she was talking about. He had to ask what he was talking about or what she was talking about. And she proceeded to tell him about proposal to list the mountain plover, and they've been looking for them, and they hadn't been able to find them. And all of a sudden, they're all here. So given Russell's background, Russell's experience, and what Russell did on a daily basis, this was quite a shock to Russell. And he finally asked the technician to leave, and the technician gave a business card for her supervisor, which later became a great friend of Russell's. But that was the way he left his introduction to the mountain plover. Next slide, please. So Russell did a little bit of research and soon learned that there was a proposal to list mountain plover. He talked to a few of his neighbors, and the neighbors told him what was liable to happen if the species was listed, at least from their perspective. And he really didn't, was really, the more he heard, the more concerned he got. But as Russell will tell you, he was raised by his family to sort of address challenges head on. So he decided to try to learn as much as he could and to try to figure out what the family branch needed to do to work their way through this particular situation. Next slide, please. So Russell was very concerned about the plover and the potential impacts on him and his family's place and on his community. Talked a lot with his neighbors, and finally decided through some very key relationship building efforts by people from Colorado, what is now Colorado Parks and Wildlife, research from Colorado State, RMBO, which is now Burke Conservancy of the Rockies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Partners Fish and Wildlife Program, and other number of other partners that understood the importance of trust, credibility, transparent communication, all the other things that people, no matter what their walk of life, sort of look for when they're entering into a potential working relationship with somebody they don't know. That made a lot of progress with Russell and convinced him that engaging was the only way that he could successfully navigate this situation. Russell will also tell you that some of the hardest conversations that he had were not necessarily with his partners; they were with members of his own family, his neighbors, that couldn't quite fathom why Russell wanted to engage with these bird people. But Russell thought through all the pros and the cons of what this would mean for him and his family and his community, depending on how this went, and he decided to engage. Next slide, please. So Russell gave permission to do research on his property. He started working with Colorado Division of Wildlife then on conservation easement. There were a lot of other wildlife values this property had in addition to the plovers. This is a part of the country where, if you're familiar with ranching in the West, there's public lands ranching and there's private lands ranching. This is still all private land, all deeded ground. No natural relationships with the BLM or the Forest Service for public lands grazing. So Russell's going through a really extended process of building trust and relationships and learning to work with all these different stakeholders. Next slide, please. So there, next slide, please. I think I'm looking for the next one here. So Russell's trying to figure out how to incorporate the plover. I think we might have missed one, Katie, or I didn't include it, but that's all right. Russell had they were trying to think about a way to sustain the community of Carville, something they could do to take advantage of this newfound relationship with the mountain plover. Carville is an extremely rural part of southeastern Colorado. So Russell, one day, about 5 or 6 years into this, suggested that maybe they have a plover festival where they would bring birders out and other people that are interested in mountain plover conservation to the ranches in the area to experience not just seeing the plover, but experience what the people did that were actually providing the habitat for the plover. And that has grown to become a very successful part of their community, something that the whole community is involved in. There's still all these success stories or all these landscape level stories. Not everybody, no, I don't care where you go, is 100% engaged with efforts like this, but there is a majority of the folks in that landscape that are supportive of plover conservation and the Plover Festival. They see it as something positive that can help keep their way of life sustained into the future as another important piece of the prairie. So Russell is now sort of bring you to the end of the story. He has become the most one of the most passionate advocates for public-private partnerships related to conservation in our nation. He's very very keen on trying to help develop young practitioners that come into the private lands arena that need to build relationships with landowners to effectively do their job. He is a member of my board of directors. He's been an instructor at NCTC on a partnership-based restoration class that was offered for a number of years, and has gone from being somebody that was very suspicious and very hesitant to be engaged with partners to one of the biggest advocates nationally for agriculture and conservation working together to achieve mutually held goals. So I think the moral of the story, or the takeaway that I have from Russell's story, is that the relationships, the trust, and the credibility, all things that are completely unrelated to what we do on the land and what habitat the lands provide, are oftentimes the most important things that we could be working on. And you never know who you have a good relationship with, how they are going to contribute to conservation locally, regionally, or nationally. So I think that's all I've got, Katie.
Thanks so much, Steve. And those pictures are really wonderful to look at. And I think it's a great example of, we talked about earlier in this session, this separation of engagement and research. And without true partnerships and trust building, and really just the time and investment that has to go into forming those, we can't get very far with conservation efforts, at least not at large scale. So that's a really, really awesome example. And did you say that Russell will be at the January workshop?
Yes, he will. He's very excited to be there.
Great. Well, we'll be thrilled to meet him and hear more about all of his efforts. Thank you so much to all of the presenters. We have a few minutes for questions. I know we have a very diverse array of presentations, topic-wise, where they fit into the realm of conservation social science. That was intentional. I hope that we can follow up with further social science focused engagement sessions and dive into certain topics more deeply. But I thought for this first one, having an array, just representing the field as a whole, its importance, its diversity, the power that really exists in conservation social science, but in human dimensions work broadly, communications, partnerships, relationship building, just people. And I think all of the presenters, you did a fantastic job doing that. So thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions that we can fit in these last couple of minutes? You can speak up or you can put them in the chat. I'll start with one because it's one that I get a lot from people who are working in species working groups and working really hard to understand the threats that tipping point species are facing on the road to recovery. What is the best way for those of you who would classify yourselves as being social scientists or having experience in engaging landowners and the general public? What are your recommendations, or do you have any tips for bird species working groups who would like to engage people with human dimensions expertise as members of their working groups? What's the sell? How can species working groups convince you all to join and to be true members of the species working groups and participate in the work that they're doing?
I can answer in terms of Like with diversity and equity, something that often comes to mind is that when you want to bring in people that have long been excluded, they're going to have different perspectives, priorities, and understandings of nature and how things are connected. So I think I know that has been something that is being discussed a lot right now, how like, you may bring in students or staff or community members, and you might have diversity in the room, but diversity of ideas is another thing, and also like equity in decision making. So I think that's just something to consider when trying to work with diverse populations, and how, because of our lived experiences, we often see how social and environmental exploitation are linked. So oftentimes we're going to try to do work that addresses all of the dimensions at the same time.
That's a really valuable perspective, Katya. Thank you. Do any of the other presenters have insights?
I might add a thought there, and I don't know how popular this will be for species-specific working groups, but I find in a lot of the groups I'm working with, we end up talking about finding those stacked social and ecological benefits, right? The multiple pathways towards kind of the end outcome we're looking for. And so I think I would encourage species specific focused efforts, when reaching out to social scientists, to perhaps be ready for some discussion broader, right, than the specific species, and just encourage you all to engage in, thinking about kind of the broad range of pathways that again can lead towards the desired result. Often, we are sort of motivated by the pathway that's most salient and relevant to us. But I think the social sciences give us the tools to identify those pathways that are most salient and relevant to others. So would add that to Katya's great comments.
Thank you. That's really helpful to hear. Steve, there's one question for you in the chat, and then I'll wrap up with a few announcements. Paul asked, he says, it appears that the biologists fell into a great relationship with Russell. How could they have been more intentional in this effort? We have a lot of biologists on the call, I think, who could be interested in that.
You bet. Well, I glossed over a lot of it. It was very intentional on the part of a number of people that understood the importance of, sort of touching on the last question too, of finding the overlap in what was of value to those landowners' perspectives and Russell's perspective compared with what the conservation folks were looking at as value, and why you value something. If you value the same thing, why you value something really is immaterial. And that's, I think, the way that they approached the very smart, very experienced people approached Russell and his neighbors, was trying to meet them where they were at, and talk about things that they could relate to, that were still very important for the conservation of the plover. So yeah, it's it could have ended very differently after Russell's initial introduction to the plover, if those people had not been on top of their game and understood how to build those types of relationships. There is a skill and there is an art to that, no doubt about it.
Yeah, it's so important and encompasses really so many parts of that wheel of themes there. So we have, in true social science format, I'm going to put a link in the chat to a survey for your feedback on this session, if you have a few minutes to complete it now or at the end. And I have a few announcements that I'm going to pull up as we wrap up our session here. Let's see if I can see the presentation button. There we go. Road to Recovery has a few, of course, it's going to be at the end. Bear with me for 1 minute as I click through. Close your eyes. Road to Recovery has a few upcoming events that I wanted to highlight. The first is that we've started a monthly species working group webinar where we're featuring the work of one working group, all whom have volunteered. You can open your eyes now if you really close them. Each month. And the next one will feature the Lesser Yellowlegs group. I know that Katie Christie was on the call at some point, and then the Lesser Yellowlegs working group is also involved with working with Partnerscapes and Steve Jester, as well as Delta Windbirds and Jason Oksima. So lots of ties into the presentations today, and that group will be sharing November 17th at the next Species Working Group webinar. I'll be following up, as I mentioned, several times with an email, and it will be lengthy, so you can read it when you have time, but it'll share links to all of the resources that were shared in this presentation, as well as answers to any other questions you all send my way that are directed towards me or to the presenters. So please feel free to continue to do that if you have questions. I know we didn't have as much time for discussion as I hoped, but I think that having the highlight of all of these different perspectives on conservation, social science, and human dimensions for bird conservation is really valuable. And finally, you'll see I put a link in the chat. Road to Recovery is hosting an in-person workshop in January at NCTC. The goal of this workshop is really to discuss, highlight, and engage in integrative recovery for tipping point bird species. So pulling in the biological sciences and strengthening our understanding of biological knowledge gaps, but at the same time and together looking at human dimensions issues and integrating conservation social science work into our efforts to recover tipping point bird species. So I have up here some of the social science topics, and these are just a few of them. We're working hard on the agenda. Many of the presenters you heard from today will be in attendance and will be presenting on these topics and others. Partnerscapes will be there at NCTC the same time, and we have some combined programming with Partnerscapes as well. So we would love to see you there. If you are someone with a social science background and you're interested in contributing to any of these topics at that workshop, please reach out to me as well. I'd love to discuss further. Thank you all so much for your attendance today, for your participation on 2 hours on a Friday afternoon. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces as well as new ones. Please check out the Road to Recovery website. There is a news and events tab that gives you links to all of these events and will be continually updated as we plan others. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend.
Bye, everyone.